What should the poverty line be? Right now it's $31,000, but there's an argument out there that it should be something more like $100,000 or even $140,000, depending on where you live. Joining us is the person who made that argument, portfolio manager and chief strategist at Simplify Asset Management, Michael Green. Michael, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You wrote a piece about the poverty line saying it should be $140,000. It went wildly viral. Explain why you think $31,000 is inadequate.
Well, first, to understand what that $31,000 is coming from, it is an old derivation of an estimate of family in crisis. Effectively, in 1963, an economist at the Department of Housing and Health and Human Services, did a calculation in which she recognized that most households were spending roughly 1/3 of their budget on food. She calculated the USDA minimum food budget, which was not dining out, et cetera. It was basically basic foodstuffs that were required for nutritional purposes, tripled that and declared that the level of the poverty line at which a family would be in crisis, that they did not have enough. That number, as early as 1966, we actually recognized that that was falling way behind. But we still formalized it for political reasons in 1969 as the way it's calculated. We then inflated it with the CPI indicator, the traditional inflation metric, and that's how we got to that 31,000 level. Unfortunately, so much has changed since the 1960s. Among other things, two-income families have become the dominant form of households. Those households need childcare, which didn't even exist in that budget, for example. And this is just one of the more shocking components. In most areas of the country, on a national average basis, childcare for 2 children is going to be about $25,000. You can't make $31,000 and have $25,000 worth of childcare expenses, and you also can't avoid those childcare expenses if you want to participate in the economy. Housing, anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000, depending on the region that you're in. Then you have to add in the concept of food, which is the original component. That's somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000, depending on where you live in the country. Those numbers add up very, very quickly, and what you discover is somewhere around that $100,000 to $140,000, depending on where you are in the country, is the point at which you can actually put a little bit of money away for next month.
So this is how you can afford transportation, it's how you can afford childcare, it's how you can afford housing, it's how you can afford food, it's how you can afford health care.
Yep.
And then to get into a position where you can put any money away, even a rainy day emergency expense account, you got to make at least $100,000?
That's pretty much what it boils down to.
There's a lot of pushback, and I'm going to get to that pushback a little later, but I want to more understand your analysis here. So you talk about the real poverty line being closer to $100,000, $140,000. What happens to the folks who are currently making somewhere between $31,000 and that $100,000 or $140,000? The $31,000 folks, they get all sorts of benefits, right?
Yeah, so some of the critics, and this is a very valid point, will highlight that at that level we should be thinking about what's called the supplemental poverty line. That incorporates the value of the benefits that you receive as a pseudo income, basically cash transfers or vouchers that are provided in the form of SNAP or EBT or housing support or child care support.
Or cheaper health care.
Or cheaper health care, right?
Yeah.
Subsidized health care. So those are all benefits that you receive at that level. As you make money going past that level, those benefits get stripped away. What economists will call the benefits cliff, or what I identified as the valley of death, in which
that does not sound good.
It doesn't sound great, and it's not a great experience, because as you move from making $31,000 to just over $40,000, you start to lose the supports associated with EBT and SNAP on the food component. As you go to about $50,000, you start to see a loss of housing support. As you go to $60,000, you start to see health care and child care subsidies disappear. Right? These are all components that effectively force households to expend cash to replace the loss of the cash benefits, and oftentimes leaves them no better off than they were when they were making $40,000.
So if I'm making $31,000 and I get a raise to $40,000, do I feel good about it, or do I feel conflicted about it?
Well, you feel conflicted about it, and that actually is the frustrating part. As somebody who really wants to see people economically active and contributing at the best of their possible ability, when somebody goes from $31,000 to $40,000 and they start losing those food benefits, the value of those food benefits are somewhere in the neighborhood of $7,000 to $10,000. And so I've made $9,000 more, but I've lost $7,000 to $10,000 worth of benefits. leaving me no better off.
You're locked into place.
You're locked into
What
place.
about how mobile you are on the economic ladder? Is it easy to save enough money to eventually buy a home, to make a down payment on anything, or if you're deciding to have kids,
Well, that's actually the crux of the issue. And so when you gave the example when we were speaking earlier about things that people can't afford, if you talk to young people, the things they're saying they can't afford are kids. And kids basically come as a package, right? There's all these expenses associated with it that you simply can't skip. You need a slightly bigger place to live. You need to make sure that the children are taken care of while you're at work, right? It's childcare. You can't avoid it. These are all components that people are being forced to confront. And really the reason why I wrote the piece, why I was interested in this subject, is because one of the enduring questions we're asking ourselves is, why aren't people getting married and having kids? Why aren't they doing this?
So why are they so angry?
Well, the reason that they're angry, and this is one of the components that I highlighted in the piece, I don't think they're so much angry at the need to work and to try to advance themselves. Where they get frustrated is they go to the grocery store where they're being forced to put things back because they're forced to economize in their budget, and they're looking at other people who are receiving the benefits that they could have received had they simply not worked.
Well, there's
as hard.
that political anger there that maybe is directed toward, this is what Donald Trump was able to seize on, anger, economic anger toward people they feel are getting it easy or getting benefits that they want. There's that, but there's also the anger of not being able to afford the American dream. We're not having access to the American dream any longer, and we're seeing that play out in our politics all over, from the election of Zoran Mamdani to the election of Donald Trump. On the extremes, there are two candidates who said that the system does not work for you, and I'm going to change the system. One of the things that I found most interesting about your Substack is, I followed Donald Trump on the campaign trail in 2015 and 2016, and I saw him reach out to working class Americans, rural Americans, former Democrats, people that voted for President Obama because they thought he was going to help their lives, and win them over. And a lot of it was the cultural message that he had, and there was obviously some anger, some xenophobia tied into it. But there was an economic aspect of it. Despite people rolling their eyes at it, there was an economic aspect, this idea, and I think you get at that so perfectly in your piece, that there is a big proportion of Americans who are working really hard, who think that there are others in this country who are not working as hard as them and are getting benefits that they want as well. Or if they're not Americans, they're immigrants who are coming into this country and they're getting a handout that they would very much need.
I think there's some truth to that. I think in particular, the election of Donald Trump was largely tied to the fact that he did reach out to those individuals and say, I hear you, right?
I see you, I hear you, I want to help you.
This is at the same time that Hillary Rodham Clinton is describing these people as deplorables. So, on both sides of the aisle, I would argue that the political parties have largely abandoned that middle. It's not the special interest groups of the extraordinarily wealthy who can contribute to campaigns. That's true across both parties. It's also not the special interest group of the designated poor who are receiving significant benefits distributed through institutional arrangements that often lead to fraud and various other components. So the anger is neglect. It's people not listening. And more than anything else, that was really the reaction that came to me from that piece. Yes, there were complaints from people at right-wing think tanks that were saying this is absurd, you can't define poverty that way, even as they acknowledged that the definition of poverty is largely arbitrary, right? We need to decide what it is and then decide how to describe it. Nobody lives in caves. Nobody's clothing themselves in animal skins anymore. Actually, ironically, that happens at the extreme rich end sometimes. But the simple reality is that we don't have an absolute poverty measure in the United States that should be compared to Guatemala or to Egypt or anywhere else. What we're really talking about is giving people the dignity to live their lives in a manner that makes them feel like they're participants in our society. And when we turn around and tell people that in that level, it's your moral failing, it's your inability to make good choices that's causing this stress in your life, that's just not true. That's not what's happening.
But help me understand the anger toward migrants.
I don't think it's actually anger towards migrants. I really don't. That was one of the things that I think was really critical to understand about this. It's anger at the unfairness. It's anger at the
Okay,
unfairness.
that's a better
that
way
we're
of putting
working
it. It's not
really,
anger
really
toward the
hard.
migrants. It's anger toward what they're getting.
I actually think it's anger towards what they are getting at no effort or perceived no effort relative to the degree of effort that's required by most Americans. And I think the inability to see that, candidly, to immediately label people as racist or unempathetic, that actually is really harming our population. The simple reality is these are good, decent people who are working really hard, care about their families, and candidly care about their communities. And when they're told that by virtue of saying, hey, that's not fair, that makes you racist, that just turns them off to the message. That makes you an invalid communicator.
There's, again, as I said a moment ago, a lot of pushback. One of the areas of pushback, which I don't think I fully understood or fully saw that you addressed, is the child care factor. I know child care is very expensive. I'm experiencing it right now. I've got a 4- and a 6-year-old. The 6-year-old's finally in public school, so we're good with that. But the 4-year-old didn't get into a public pre-K that we can get her to. So she's in a private pre-K, and it's expensive. There's also babysitter costs. But that is for a distinct period of time. You know, once your kids get into an elementary school, for the majority of the day, if they're in a public school and at least a well-funded public school, they're there from as early as 6 a.m. to as late as 6 p.m. So the child care cost does diminish over time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But in order to get to that point, you have to jump over that hurdle. And so, if I basically put up a giant wall that says, do not enter here, I can't be surprised when people don't walk through.
What about the criticism that you are not you're not accounting for the lifestyle that people currently live? And people are not living in tenements any longer. So yeah, the housing is going to cost more because they're living in single-family homes or single-family apartments. They have more space. They have better access to better health care than they ever did before, and that's going to be more expensive. Prices are high because there is an increased demand. They want things. They're buying things. They have luxury items like a cell phone. They have a nice car. These are aspects to life today that critics argue you don't factor into this idea of poverty.
Yeah, so I actually just think that that's wrong, and I'll lay it out very simply. First, when we think about the components of what you can buy, you can't buy a 1950s car. You can't buy 1950s health insurance. You can't buy bias-ply tires on your car, which would be cheaper than the radials that you're buying because they're illegal. Right? You likewise can't do many of the things that you said. If we were just willing to live like that, it's not allowed. You can't skip health insurance. You can't do these things that you were arguing. My critics will say, you shouldn't look at that, right? The simple reality is we don't have the choices. What we're actually doing is we have mandated that there's certain behaviors and certain components to it. Tenements no longer exist because we made them illegal. Right, standing room occupancy. There was just an article in the New York Times highlighting this is how people used to live. For young people moving to New York, staying at the YMCA, engendered a song in the 1970s, but ultimately it was a standard of living that many people had that freed them to live in the city at very low cost. Those have largely been made impossible for people to access today. So you have people like my daughter paying $2,700 to live in a 3-bedroom, 1-bath unit. She's paying $2,700. Her roommates are also paying that amount, right? So the total amount of their rent is close to $8,000. That they'd be more than happy to live in an SRO type facility or a traditional young women's Christian organization type environment, but they don't have that option. And so it's specious to pretend that they do.
You say it's the price of participation.
That is really what it is. It is we have actually outlawed so many of the behaviors that we would have allowed in the past and the choices that we would have had in the past, and simultaneously raised that participation. And the perverse component that most of the economists that are arguing against my analysis don't understand when they say, well, we've raised that by the inflation amount. The inflation metrics that we use in the United States are designed for a general purpose population, not for those who are near the bottom end of the spectrum where you face very few choices and candidly are limited in your choices. I'll give you a really simple example. Larger houses and air conditioning. The way the BLS treats that for CPI is it says because the quality of the house went up, the price reflects that improvement in quality. And so the actual cash outlay is not what we're measuring. We're measuring the quality adjusted housing. Well, the person who's at the lower end of that spectrum, when we were introducing air conditioning, would choose homes that didn't have air conditioning because those were offered at a discount.
So you're saying there's no longer the choice.
There's
so
no
right
longer the
now
choice.
you can't choose to have something of lesser quality. You can't choose to have I mean, you go onto the lot to try to buy a car. They say that these are all optional features to the car, the power steering and the power windows. And the stereo, whatever. But in reality, you cannot walk off the lot with a car that does not have those things.
You can't walk off the lot with a car that doesn't have those things, nor can you insure that car, nor can you pass inspection with that car. So it's completely impractical and unrealistic to argue that that is descriptive of the vehicle that people want to be purchasing. The second component of it is that we went through the COVID experience where, like every pandemic in history, people left urban environments, moved to less urban environments in which there were fewer people around them. That necessitated a rush or a run on automobiles at the same time that production fell off tied to the COVID pandemic. That meant that people were suddenly forced to buy much more expensive cars and to finance them at extraordinarily high rates. And people are dealing with that in today's world.
So they don't have the choice. So you're arguing that the CPI adjusted, inflation adjusted poverty line is still wildly inaccurate.
It's wildly inaccurate.
And inadequate.
And very much inadequate.
I want to ask about, well, actually, I'm going to ask about transportation real fast because you had a pretty high number for transportation.
About $14,000.
$14,000. If you live in New York City, it's not $14,000. How'd you get to $14,000?
The $14,000 again is lifted from the MIT living wage when you factor in the cost of 2 cars that are in operating condition that will succeed.
So you're going into a place that does not have public transportation.
You're going to a place that doesn't have public transportation, which is the experience of the vast majority of Americans. And candidly, if you go into New York City and you look at public transportation, or you look at public transportation, what's happening around the rest of the country, this is one of the points that I made, is that people who have affluence, who have the means, are increasingly withdrawing from the system. When I lived in New York City, I traveled on the subway all the time. It was certainly not a luxurious experience, but at least it felt adequately safe.
But it's an efficient experience.
It's an incredibly efficient experience, and I still take the subway. But the reality is what people are reacting to in the subway is the feeling of unsafeness, the randomness of what you're being exposed to. Traveling on public transportation and being set on fire. Now, is that going to happen to everybody? Of course not, right? But when those conditions exist, if you're wealthy and you insulate that from yourself by taking a car, you're taking advantage of an experience that people in a city like New York, where you're then going to pay an extreme price for living in that environment, where you don't have to take public transportation.
You also take money out of the system and make it just less functional because it doesn't have the same funding that it would have if everybody did participate. Let me ask about COVID because I think your analysis of COVID was really interesting. COVID, for all of its drawbacks, people went home. They weren't paying for transportation. They weren't paying for childcare. They weren't going out to eat. They weren't traveling. And then suddenly they felt like, for the first time in forever, they could save.
Well, I would say that there's several things about the COVID experience. One is that cost avoidance, right? So many economists will point to the surge in savings that existed around COVID, and we will assume that that was a function of the transfer payments that were made. The transfer payments that were made...
The checks that came from the government.
The checks that came from the government, right? $600 checks are slightly increasing the compensation associated with unemployment. Those certainly positively contributed. I'm not going to deny that. But the surge in the savings that we saw was actually you not having to pay for childcare, and at the same time the childcare worker receiving support so that they weren't unemployed or the equivalent of unemployed. It basically created conditions that would have looked like the 1950s for many people, where they suddenly had somebody at home and they had the experience of being together as a family, and various forms of entertainment were relatively limited. And interestingly enough, consumer sentiment surged, right? People were actually really happy in that environment.
People were buying a whole lot of stuff online.
Well, they were buying stuff online in part because they had savings and they were able to meet or basically suddenly obtain the things that they had wanted or desired in a variety of ways. But I would argue that equally important, there was a component of a shared sacrifice, right? We're all in this together.
For a time, at least.
For at least a short time. And certainly there were conflicts between red states and blue states in terms of what was the appropriate response to it. And I think on both sides, we probably took it a little bit too far. But the simple reality is suddenly it was a communal experience. In a lot of ways, perversely, like one of the other things you highlighted that people can no longer afford, going to a professional sporting event, right? These are communal experiences that allow us to feel like we're part of a community. And when we were all huddled into our houses and being forced to stay 6 feet away to protect each other, we at least kind of felt that we were all in the same game.
I understand that. I think there's been an emotional, psychological hangover from COVID that we're dealing with in this country. But I think there's also been, I guess you argue there's been a financial hangover. What happened when we came out of COVID?
Well, when we came out of COVID, first of all, those expenses started to return, right? The return to work component. People didn't naturally get raises to offset those increases in costs. They suddenly just discovered them. And when they went back, they found that childcare was dramatically more expensive. The housing that they had purchased in a rural environment, suddenly they had to get rid of that housing and move back into rental units that were closer to their work so that they could actually return to work.
And those rental units went up in price?
The rental units in New York City exploded.
Yeah. So the money that they had saved, they lost, or they had to spend?
They had to spend.
And they were no longer able to save the money?
They were no longer able to save.
So the financial hangover was anger?
Well, the financial experience was very much one of fear more than anything else, and I think we see this. But the most important component of it is that businesses reimpose those costs on their employees without necessarily recognizing that they were doing it.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is the feeling that people have now. Why do people feel so bad about the current situation? When you look at the numbers, there is inflation, the prices, things are more expensive, yes, but there's also another psychological component to that, and you argue this in your piece, that people remember how good it was or how good it could be during COVID and are now especially frustrated or angry because of the situation they find themselves in now.
I think that's, yes, so I absolutely think that's the case. We had a momentary glimpse at what it was like to live in a less complicated time. And many of us actually found that somewhat liberating. On the flip side of it, I think the much bigger issue that we face is a general sense of trust, right? There's a tremendous loss of trust. I wrote another piece called Getting Sentimental. It didn't go viral. But ultimately, if you look at the sentiment indicators, what they betray is not so much that the economic conditions are really terrible. It's simply that we no longer trust leadership on both sides.
Yeah, we don't trust that they're able to actually address our concerns and our needs. Let me play Donald Trump talking about that, talking about affordability.
You're doing better than you've ever done. Getting lower prices, bigger paychecks. We're getting inflation. We're crushing it. They say affordability. And everyone says, oh, that must mean Trump has high prices. No, our prices are coming down tremendously. You don't need $37 for your daughter. 2 or 3 is nice, but you don't need $37.
Is this a man who's in touch with the needs of the American public?
So I'll be very straightforward with you. I voted for Donald Trump. I don't think that that represents somebody who is in touch with the experience that Americans are going through right now. And I think that's unfortunately one of the reasons why his polling numbers are deteriorating rapidly.
Why Republicans are losing in elections across the country.
I think Republicans are losing in elections for a variety of reasons, right? In many situations, we haven't addressed the concerns that people face. And as a result, they're simply saying, well, I'll try someone else again, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of pattern that we're experiencing, where we're effectively bouncing back and forth between the two parties, that's a symptom of the middle, basically saying neither of these people really represents my interests or needs, but the last one didn't work, so let's try out the new one.
So what is the solution? I mean, Donald Trump is talking about, he promised to lower prices. He has not done so, and we've seen the reaction to that and in his poll numbers. What is the solution? How do you lower prices? How do you make life affordable and enjoyable for Americans?
Well, ultimately, we need to re-embrace growth. And the answer to that is through the tax code. We need to re-incentivize our tax code system to bias towards labor and away from capital. Listen, I'm a traitor to my class in this context. I've floated reform proposals that would ultimately hit me the most. Right?
So tax capital, not labor?
You need to tax capital more, which means higher income Americans will have to pay more. And at the same time, we need to expand the rewards to work, things like an expansion of the earned income tax credit, which was originally a Milton Friedman proposal designed to address the welfare state and the idea that people were getting unearned benefits. An earned income tax credit is returning cash to people if they're not making enough to actually cover those components. It addresses dynamics of the benefits cliff, but most importantly, it gives people cash that allows them to make choices. I have no idea what a family in Caldwell, New Jersey or Lynchburg, Virginia really needs, but what I want to do is empower them to make those choices. Because what that really does is it sends price signals to the economy. Capitalism is all about the exchange of information through prices. When you mandate that workers have to make X, you've taken freedom away. When you mandate that employers have to provide this service, you've taken freedom away. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is you want to empower the individual and the family to make choices.
You want to put cash in their
theirs.
pockets.
You want to put cash in their pockets that they can use how they see fit.
Is it just the tax code? I mean, changing it and taxing capital more than you're taxing labor, and I think that's a pretty straightforward solution. What about the disparity between what a CEO makes and what a worker makes? We haven't seen a disparity like this in what is it, 100 years? We're getting to Gilded Age stage when you have Jeff Bezos buying out Venice to have a wedding. I know that's an extreme example of it there, but you have a lot of these very, very, very rich CEOs going around flaunting their wealth, buying new yachts, while the average worker is, again, struggling to pay for healthcare, struggling to pay for housing, struggling to pay for their daily commute. Is there a way to address the disparity, the inequality, by adjusting the gap between a CEO and the worker?
Well, I actually think those sorts of extreme examples are not really helpful, right? They create basically points of anger more than anything else. Candidly, I think it's awesome that Jeff Bezos decided to rent out Venice. He's more than welcome to rent out my house for his next event at similar pricing. He should be free to spend his money however he wants.
Should he? But we can argue about whether Jeff Bezos actually deserves the amount of money that he's making. Elizabeth Warren would say that he used the infrastructure of this country and he needs to pay more to put it back into the American economy, into the American workers' hands. But honestly, though, address the gap between CEOs and workers, because it is bigger than it has been in a long time.
Well, I think, unfortunately, that is simply a byproduct of our underlying flawed tax code. And really, I want to emphasize this. Again, I don't care what somebody makes at the top end. They're fully entitled to make whatever they want. Part of our question is, what are they entitled to keep? Elizabeth Warren is correct that Jeff Bezos built off of the infrastructure of this country, just as every American family builds off the infrastructure in this country. Our American citizenship is by far the most valuable asset that most of us hold. And so to respect that, we need to recognize we're part of a community, and we need to recognize we need to fund that community for healthy development. When you're talking about the tax code is actually where money gets spent. And this is what people don't understand. This is why DOGE was such a disaster, because it was looking for fraud in government. It was looking for excess spending. The reality is the federal government doesn't spend a lot of money. It spends money in defense, and it spends money in limited other areas, but vast majority of what the federal government does is transfer money. Right? Now, the reason that the tax code holds the key to this is because the tax code is ultimately where spending occurs. When you carve out a special interest exemption for private equity or hedge funds, or you create conditions under which earnings above $167,000 are no longer taxed at a FICA framework, or you lower the capital gains tax, or you incentivize debt over equity in capital structures, those are choices that are made within the tax code that ultimately create spending. That's how we treat it within the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. It is treated as spending through the tax code, and that's the area that we need to target.
So I'm going to argue that you are not a fan of trickle-down economics?
I think that trickle-down economics is a mischaracterization of what works, right? Innovation is what trickles down. Luxuries that are invented for Jeff Bezos' wedding in Venice slowly trickle down and become available to the average person, and that's a wonderful thing. The perspectives that were built into the Sistine Chapel, if we're talking about areas like Rome or Venice, et cetera, in the old world, those are tremendous innovations that we all have been able to benefit from in a trickle-down framework. But the idea that Jeff Bezos' spending is somehow going to trickle down to me or to the average American, that's just flawed.
All right, so tax the rich more.
Well, again, I don't think it should be done in a form of retribution. Being angry about other people's success.
I don't think that's anger.
Not
I think that is. I think you're arguing to make it more fair and to make it more functional, and to make the country better as a whole.
Well, I think all that's true, but I think the most important thing is to tell the truth. And so candidly, on both the left and the right, we've done a disservice to Americans by allowing narratives to emerge like the top 1% pay 50% of the taxes, and therefore we need to bend over backwards to make sure they don't leave, right? The simple reality is many of the programs that have been introduced by the Trump administration are actually incredibly helpful for the left, but you're ignoring that because of your political affiliation. Things like tariffs actually are mechanisms that can be used to trap capital in the United States. We've reintroduced mechanisms that allow us to bias towards labor over capital by basically encouraging the production to happen in the United States. That increased production will raise prices, but it also will raise incomes and make things ultimately much more affordable if we're able to basically recognize that what we're trying to do is trap that capital here so that we can employ it and use it effectively.
All right, Michael, I promised you 25 minutes. I think we went 35. Thank you so much
a real pleasure.
for helping me understand your thoughts on the poverty line and how it's actually not at all accurate. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.